I have heard thousands of confessions in my life. I have sat beside the dying. I have buried mothers, fathers, and children. But nothing prepared me for the afternoon. A woman named Teresa walked into my rectory office and told me what happened to her during the 4 minutes. Her heart stopped beating on an operating table. She wasn't crying. She wasn't shaking. She was calm, too calm. The way people are when they've seen something so real, it no longer frightens them. It just changes them. Father, she said, I need to tell someone before I lose the courage. And I think God wants you to share it. What she told me that day, I have never forgotten. I've shared pieces of it in homilies. I've prayed over whether to tell it fully. But today I believe it's time. Because what Teresa saw on the other side wasn't just a private vision. It was a warning, a mercy, and a message meant for every person listening to me right now, whether you believe in God or not, whether you've been to church in decades or you go every single day. She saw souls. She saw fire that did not destroy but purified. She saw a face she recognized, one she never expected to see again. And she heard words spoken directly to her that she says were not meant for her alone. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you may never look at your own life or your own death the same way again. The beginning. Let me start at the beginning, because the beginning matters. Teresa was 52 years old, a school teacher, married 30 years, with 2 grown children. The kind of woman you'd see at the 10 o'clock Sunday Mass, sitting in the same pew, reciting the same responses out of habit more than conviction. She told me later, Father, I believed in God the way I believed in gravity. It was just there. I never thought about it. That changed on a Tuesday morning in March. She was at home making coffee when the pain hit. A crushing weight in her chest, like someone had placed a car on top of her heart. Her husband found her on the kitchen floor and called 911. By the time paramedics arrived, she had no pulse. They worked on her in the ambulance, and they worked on her in the emergency room for 4 minutes. By every medical measure, Teresa was dead. This is where her story, and I want to be careful here, because I am not in the business of chasing mystical experiences for entertainment, takes a turn I cannot explain away. Neither could the 3 doctors who later reviewed her case. Teresa said the pain vanished instantly, not faded, vanished, like a switch had been flipped. She said she became aware of floating, though floating wasn't quite the word she used. It felt less like movement and more like her attention had simply relocated. She could see the room. She could see her own body on the table, gray and still, doctors working over it with the kind of controlled urgency you only see in real emergencies. And I wasn't afraid, Father, she told me. That's the strangest part. I should have been terrified. I felt more alive than I had in years. Then, she said, the room fell away. Not violently, not like a special effect in a movie, but the way you wake from a dream within a dream. One layer of reality peeling back to reveal another, more solid, more real than the one she'd just left. I want to pause here and say something important, because I think it matters for what comes next. Near-death experiences are not new. The church does not require belief in any private revelation, including this one. What I am about to tell you is Teresa's testimony, and I share it not because you must believe every detail, but because the fruit of what she experienced, the change it produced in her life and in the lives of everyone she's since told, bears every mark of something authentic. Scripture tells us, by their fruits you will know them. Teresa's fruit was conversion, radical, permanent, undeniable conversion, the light. She said the next thing she became aware of was light. Not blinding light, not the cliche tunnel and light of secular accounts, though in a sense there was something of both. She said the light did not simply illuminate, it seemed to know her. She used a phrase that struck me deeply. It was like standing in front of someone who had read every page of my life and loved me anyway. That, she said, was the moment everything she thought she understood about God cracked open. Like so many of us, Teresa had spent her whole life assuming God was distant, watching from far away, keeping score. She'd always pictured judgment like a courtroom, cold, clinical, terrifying. What she experienced instead, she said, was closer to being known completely. Every sin, every failure, every secret shame she had buried for decades. And the light did not recoil from her. It grieved with her. It ached over the moment she had turned away from love. But it did not condemn her. I understood in that moment, she said, that hell is not God punishing us. Hell is what happens when a soul refuses, all the way to the end, to let itself be loved. God never stops offering it, but He will not force it. I remember sitting across from her in my office, notebook in hand, feeling the hair rise on my arms, because that is not something a lukewarm Catholic school teacher invents on her own. That is not something you learn from a Sunday homily. That is deep, ancient, patristic theology, the kind Augustine and Aquinas wrestled with across volumes, coming out of the mouth of a woman who 3 days earlier couldn't have told you the difference between venial and mortal sin. Something real had happened to her. The valley, what she described next, is the part that, when I first heard it, made me set down my pen entirely. Teresa said that after the light, after the overwhelming sense of being known and loved, she was shown something she never expected and never wanted to see: purgatory. She did not use that word lightly. She told me she had barely thought about it before that day. One of those doctrines Catholics nod along to without really considering, tucked somewhere between the Nicene Creed and the parts of the Catechism nobody rereads after confirmation class. But what she saw, she said, left no doubt in her mind about what she was witnessing. She described a vast space, not dark, not menacing, but not comfortable either. The best comparison she could offer was standing at the edge of a great, quiet valley at dusk, where the light hadn't fully gone, but the sun had already set. Souls. She was very specific about this word. Souls, not bodies, not ghosts, were present all around her, though she couldn't say exactly how she perceived them. Some radiated a kind of muted glow, like embers cooling. Others seemed almost translucent, worn thin, as though something essential in them was still being refined. It wasn't punishment the way we think of punishment, she told me, leaning forward, choosing her words carefully. It was more like watching metal be purified. You know how gold has to be melted down to burn away the impurities? It was like that. Painful, yes. I could feel that some of them were suffering. But it wasn't cruelty. It was love finishing a work that mercy had started. She felt an overwhelming, aching compassion for these souls. A compassion so intense it startled her, because she realized they were not strangers to her. They were, in some way she couldn't fully explain, connected to her, connected to all of us. She used the phrase, the family of God. And in that moment, she understood with total clarity why the church has always taught us to pray for the dead. Not as a nice sentiment, not as tradition for tradition's sake, but because those souls could feel our prayers like warmth reaching them across the valley. They can't help themselves anymore, Father, she said, her composure finally breaking, tears sliding down her face. They're desperate for us to remember them. Every Mass we offer, every rosary, every simple Lord, have mercy whispered for a soul we've forgotten. It reaches them. I felt it. I felt what it does for them. This is, I should note, entirely consistent with what the church has always taught. From the second book of Maccabees, where Judas Maccabeus takes up a collection for sacrifices on behalf of the fallen, to the ancient practice of praying for the dead found in the catacombs, to the modern catechism's teaching that the church commends the dead to God's mercy and offers her prayers, especially the holy. Sacrifice of the Eucharist on their behalf. Teresa hadn't studied any of this. She was simply describing, in plain and trembling language, something the church has proclaimed for 2,000 years, Uncle Frank. Then Teresa told me something she had not expected at all. Among the souls in that valley, she saw a face. She recognized it instantly, though she hadn't seen it in 15 years and hadn't thought of it in months. It was her Uncle Frank, her mother's brother, a man who had died, estranged from the family, who had walked away from the church in his 30s and never come back, who had by every account lived a hard and bitter life, and who had died alone in a hospital room with no family present. I actually thought for one horrible second that he must be in hell, Teresa admitted. That's what we all assumed when he died. We didn't even know how to pray for him. Some of my cousins said it wasn't worth praying for a man like that. But there he was, not condemned, not lost, present in that place of purification, being refined, being healed, being drawn slowly and lovingly toward the light Teresa herself had just come from. Frank looked at her and he spoke. Teresa told me she felt no fear looking at her uncle. Only a flood of love, so overwhelming it nearly knocked her over, if over even meant anything in that place. Frank had died the way a lot of men of his generation die, quietly, bitterly convinced the church had failed him somewhere along the way, that God, if he existed at all, had certainly stopped paying attention to a man like him. He drank. He isolated himself. He said cruel things to the people who tried to reach him. By the time cancer took him, there was almost no one left in his life to grieve him properly. The family said a quiet, awkward funeral mass, more out of obligation than devotion, and then largely moved on. I don't even think my own mother prayed for him after the funeral, Teresa admitted, shame heavy in her voice. We just assumed there was nothing more to be done. Or worse, some of us assumed he'd gotten what he deserved. But standing in that valley of purifying light, Frank did not look bitter or angry. Teresa said his face held an expression she had never once seen on him in life. A kind of peace mixed with longing, like a man finally walking home after decades lost in the wilderness. He communicated with her, she said, not through sound exactly, but through understanding transferred directly, soul to soul, faster and clearer than any spoken sentence could carry. I asked Teresa to repeat what he told her multiple times over several visits because I wanted to capture it as faithfully as I could. This is as close as I can render it. Tell them I am not lost. Tell them mercy reached, even me, at the very end, in ways they cannot imagine. A single sincere thought of sorrow, a flicker of desire for God in my last conscious moment was enough for it to catch me. But tell them also, do not assume, as they did, that a soul like mine no longer needs their prayers. I am here, and I am being healed, but I am not yet home. Every Mass offered for me is a rope thrown down into this valley. Every rosary is a hand reaching for mine. Do not let anyone go unremembered the way I nearly was. Pray for the ones no one else prays for. You have no idea how much it matters. Teresa said that when he finished, the light around him brightened slightly, as though the message itself had cost him something to give, or perhaps had been granted to him specifically because he asked for the chance to say it. I sat with that for a long time after she told me, and I want to sit with it with you now, because I think this is the heart of the entire message. The reason I believe God allowed Teresa to see what she saw and come back to tell it. We live in an age that has largely forgotten purgatory. We either dismiss it as medieval superstition, or we quietly assume, without ever really examining why, that everyone we love who has died is instantly and automatically in heaven. No purification necessary, no continued need for our prayers. Funerals have become celebrations of life, where the explicit petition for mercy on the soul of the deceased gets buried under sentimental eulogies. We say he's in a better place now and move on. In doing so, we may be abandoning souls who are desperately waiting, as Frank was, for someone to remember them. The Catechism is not vague on this point. It states plainly that all who die in God's grace but are still imperfectly purified undergo purification so as to achieve the holiness necessary to enter the joy of heaven. It is not a fringe belief or optional Catholic folklore. It is a doctrine of the faith, rooted in Scripture, affirmed at the councils of Florence and Trent, and echoed in the unbroken practice of the Church from her earliest days. Teresa's vision. However you choose to weigh it, since private revelation is always subject to the judgment of the Church and never binding on the faithful, lines up with every bit of that ancient teaching. It doesn't contradict doctrine. It illustrates it. It makes it real, urgent, and personal in a way catechism classes rarely manage to do. The Guardian. But Teresa's experience did not end with her uncle. There was one more encounter waiting for her in that valley, one that would deliver a message meant not just for her family, but, I believe, for every person hearing this story today. After Frank's message settled into her, like a stone dropped into still water, rippling outward, changing everything it touched, Teresa became aware that the light was calling her forward again, back toward the source she had come from. But before she could move, another presence appeared. This one, she said, felt different. It didn't feel like a soul undergoing purification. It felt, in her words, like standing next to someone who had never once, in their entire existence, been anything but pure love. She described a figure she could not fully look at directly, not out of fear, but because the intensity of goodness radiating from it was almost too much to take in, the way you can't stare directly at the sun even on a clear day. She believes, though she is careful never to claim it with certainty, that this was her guardian angel. It communicated with the same soul-to-soul clarity Frank had used, but its tone was different. Not weary or longing, but urgent and focused, like someone delivering a message they had been entrusted with and needed to get exactly right. You're being sent back, it told her. Not because your work on earth is finished, but because it has barely begun. What you have seen here is not for you alone. You must tell them plainly, without softening it, without fear of how it will be received. Time is not what they think it is. Teresa said this phrase struck her harder than almost anything else she witnessed. Time is not what they think it is. The presence went on to explain, in a way Teresa struggled to translate fully into human language, that souls on earth treat their days as though they are infinite, as though there will always be another Sunday to finally go back to confession, another year to finally forgive the estranged sibling, another decade to finally get serious about prayer. But from where she stood, looking at that valley full of souls, desperately clinging to the mercy their loved ones' prayers could still offer them, she understood with total clarity that the window we are given is short, and most of us spend it as though it will never close. Tell them, the presence said, that mercy is real, and it is greater than anything they can imagine, greater than their worst sin, greater than their deepest shame. But tell them also that mercy is not presumption. They cannot spend a lifetime turning away from love and assume the door will simply be standing open, unlocked, waiting for the day they finally decide to knock. The door is open now, today. This is the day mercy asks to be let in, Teresa said. She wept, not from fear, but from a kind of grief she'd never experienced before. Grief for every wasted Sunday, every excuse she'd made for skipping Mass, every year she'd let slide by, treating her faith as background noise rather than the center of her life. Then, she said, she was shown one more thing quickly, almost like a final image pressed into her memory before she was sent back. Faintly, as though glimpsed through fog, what her own life might have looked like had she died that day exactly as she had been living it, comfortable, complacent, faithful in name only. She was firm that she was not shown hell and does not claim to have seen it. What she was shown, she said, was distance, the terrifying, aching distance a soul can create between itself and God. One small refusal, one small compromise, one small "I'll get to it later" at a time. It wasn't that God moved away from me, Father, she said. It's that I had been moving away from him my whole life, 1 inch at a time, and I never even noticed the gap growing. Then everything went dark, and the next thing she knew, she was staring up at fluorescent hospital lights, a doctor's hand still pressed against her chest, a nurse calling out that they had a pulse. 4 minutes. That's all it had been by the clock on the wall. 4 minutes that, for Teresa, held an eternity's worth of truth. Coming back, Teresa spent 3 weeks in the hospital recovering physically. She told me the physical recovery was, in some strange way, the easiest part. It was the spiritual reckoning that nearly broke her. For the first few days, she could barely speak to anyone about it. She was terrified people would think she'd lost her mind, or worse, that they'd politely nod and change the subject the way people do when someone shares something too raw, too real for casual conversation. So she said nothing, simply watching her family, her husband bringing her coffee, her children checking their phones in the waiting room, the hospital chaplain making his obligatory rounds. And she felt, for the first time in her life, the enormous, terrifying weight of how quickly all of it could be gone. By the time she came to see me, it had been almost 2 months. She said she'd spent that time praying more than she had in the previous 20 years combined, wrestling with whether God actually wanted her to share what happened or whether it was simply meant for her. A private mercy, a private wake-up call, nothing more. But then I kept thinking about Frank, she told me. And I kept thinking, how many other Franks are out there? How many families have someone like him? Someone they've written off, someone they've stopped praying for because they assumed it was hopeless or assumed it didn't matter anymore. I couldn't keep that to myself. I felt like keeping it to myself would be its own kind of sin, what the message means. This is the part of Teresa's story that I believe carries the most weight for everyone listening. Because whatever you believe about near-death experiences, whatever level of scrutiny you apply to private revelation, The message itself stands entirely on its own, rooted firmly in what the church has always taught. First, purgatory is real, and our prayers for the dead matter more than we know. Every Mass offered for a deceased loved one, every rosary, every offering of suffering, these are not symbolic gestures. According to the constant teaching of the Church, they are genuine aid extended across the boundary of death itself. Padre Pio said he feared the souls in purgatory suffering from neglect far more than he feared the souls suffering the pains themselves, because the pains are purifying and finite, but neglect prolongs the waiting. If you have someone in your life who died estranged from the faith, who died without the sacraments, who died in a way that made your family quietly assume the worst, do not stop praying for them. Teresa's message and the Church's ancient teaching converge perfectly here. It is never too late to pray for the dead, and it is never wasted effort. Second, mercy is real, and it is far larger than we believe. But it is not something to be presumed upon. Teresa's vision of her uncle's final moment conversion echoes exactly what the Church calls the mercy of the last moment. The theological reality that a single sincere act of contrition, even seconds before death, even after a lifetime of rejection, can open the door to salvation. This is not a loophole. It is the boundless nature of divine mercy. But, and this is critical, presuming on that mercy, gambling your entire life on a hoped-for deathbed conversion, is precisely the kind of spiritual laziness that both Scripture and the saints warn against relentlessly. Do not delay conversion to the Lord. Do not put it off from day to day. For suddenly the wrath of the Lord will come, we read in the book of Sirach. Third, and this may be the hardest part of Teresa's message to hear, time is not a guarantee. Not for any of us, not for anyone reading this, no matter how young or healthy or far off death may seem. Teresa was 52, making coffee on an ordinary Tuesday morning, with no history of heart problems, no warning signs, nothing that would have told her this was the day. If it can happen to her exactly as she was, it can happen to any of us, what Teresa did next. The first thing Teresa did, once she found the courage, was have a Mass offered for her Uncle Frank. Not just one. She began having Masses offered for him regularly, along with a daily rosary, something she admitted she hadn't prayed with any consistency since she was a teenager. She told me she felt, almost immediately, a strange and unexpected peace whenever she prayed for him. Not proof, she was careful to say. Not evidence in any scientific sense, but a quiet, persistent sense that her prayers were landing somewhere, reaching someone, doing something real. She reached out to family members she hadn't spoken to in years, cousins who had written Frank off entirely, an aunt who had refused to even attend his funeral out of old, bitter resentment. She didn't lecture them. She simply told them what she'd seen, gently, humbly, the same way she told me. Some dismissed it. A few, she said, wept, because underneath the old grudges they had been quietly carrying guilt for how they'd treated him. Teresa's story gave them permission to finally do something about it. Slowly, a small circle of family members began praying for Frank together, something that would have seemed unthinkable a year earlier. She also changed her own life in ways both small and enormous. She went to confession, a real confession, the first honest one she'd made in over a decade, unloading years of buried guilt she'd been carrying without even fully realizing the weight of it. She started going to daily Mass when her schedule allowed. She began praying specifically, by name, for the souls in her life who had died without anyone left to remember them. An elderly neighbor who'd passed with no family nearby, a former student who had died young in an accident, a coworker's estranged father none of them had ever met. I used to think prayer for the dead was this vague, optional thing. She told me during one of our last conversations before I began sharing pieces of her story publicly. Now I think it might be one of the most important things any of us can do. And almost nobody's doing it. She started something small at her parish, a simple monthly gathering, just a handful of people at first, praying a rosary specifically for the souls in purgatory, especially the forgotten ones, the ones with no family left to pray for them. It has grown steadily since. What began with 4 people in a side chapel now regularly draws 30 or more. And I've heard from other priests that similar groups have started forming after hearing pieces of Teresa's story.